solve large, intractable problems.
It's a new venture altogether.
Your brain is a wild horse there.
Because remember, writing is not a team sport.
You are not selling horse carriages when there are cars.
I want to be known only as the trusted advisor.
More like a tourist.
Play to Potential podcast.
In the book, one of the things I quote this psychiatrist on the Upper East Side of New York City who worked with women who were mostly either very senior women in investment banking or very senior women in law firms. And she said that about 80% of the clients who come to see her in the first session say, I want you to know I'm not ambitious. Well, you don't get to be partner in a New York City top 10 law firm if you're not ambitious. It doesn't just fall into your lap. So it's that discomfort with being perceived of as ambitious or the language around ambition. And I think that has inhibited women often from really developing, making the commitment to develop to their full potential.
Welcome to the 74th conversation at the Play to Potential podcast. I'm your host Deepak Jayaraman, and this podcast is my labor of love for the long term to have conversations with leading practitioners, thinkers, authors, artists, sportsmen, and other leading professionals to decode insights around leadership, transitions, and careers. When I'm not podcasting, I'm working with leaders as a trusted sounding board, helping them and organizations play to their full potential. To know more about what's in the podcast archives and the advisory work I do, just visit playtopotential.com. It's PLAYTO, the word potential.com. My guest this time is Sally Helgesen. Sally is an internationally best-selling author, speaker, and leadership coach. Her most recent book, How Women Rise, co-authored with executive coach Marshall Goldsmith, who himself has been on this podcast earlier, examines the behaviors most likely to get in the way of successful women. It became the top seller in its field within a week of publication, and rights have been sold in 15 languages. Her previous books include The Female Advantage, Women's Ways of Leadership, and The Female Vision, Women's Real Power at Work, which explores how women's strategic insights can strengthen their careers. And her book, The Web of Inclusion, A New Architecture for Building Great Organizations, was cited in the Wall Street Journal as one of the best books on leadership of all time, and is credited with bringing the language of inclusion into business. Without further ado, let's dive into the conversation with Sally Helgesen. Sally, thank you so much for making the time and coming on the Play to Potential podcast. Really excited to have you.
My pleasure, Deepak. Good to be with you.
Sally, in this podcast, we have conversations around three themes: leadership, transitions, and careers. Maybe before we dive into your book and your insights around women leadership, would love to know how you got into this topic, Sally. You've been researching women leadership for a while. Could you talk to us a little bit about how you got here?
Yes, I've been in this field now. This is 31 years. And it really started in the 1980s. I was working in corporate communications with some really excellent companies, mostly in New York, but also in Texas. And what I noticed in the companies I worked with is they didn't have any clue as to how to think about women's leadership potential. They had a lot of women who had a lot to give, but it was much more, they weren't thinking about any kind of leadership or strategic potential. So I decided that one way of addressing this would be to try to write a book about what women who were really, really successful as leaders had to contribute. And I began interviewing women, and it came together as a book called The Female Advantage, Women's Ways of Leadership, which was published in 1990. And I'm proud to say it's still in print, which is unusual.
Wow.
But because I think The Female Advantage was the first book that looked at what women had to contribute rather than how they needed to change and adapt, companies began calling me right off the bat asking me to come in, talk to their women, give advice, work with their women. So I just found that extraordinarily rewarding. So I decided to go out on my own and see if I could make it work. And the last 31 years have suggested that it has.
Wow. I'm sure this appeals to at least 50% of the population. So I'm sure there's a big need out there to solve this situation. And before we get into some of the insights you discuss in your book, Sally, I would love to set context a little bit around your research and how we should think about some of the findings from your research. And maybe to get statistical for a couple of seconds, I was curious about a couple of situations, right? Some women who may not necessarily fall in the framework that you lay out in terms of the archetypes that you suggest, and some men who might identify with some of the themes you suggest. So could you talk a little bit about how we should think about some of your insights and how it applies to men and women?
Certainly. And you're right on both points, although I will say that the book has been out a little more than 3 years, and I've done thousands and thousands of programs all over the world. And I've only once had a woman come up to me and say, I didn't identify with any of the habits or behaviors in this world, in the book. But that's only happened once. But often there are women who identify with just a few of them. And usually, we're all human beings. So we're all different. We're all kind of on a curve. And our experience shapes us as well. So what I find is that as women become more senior, they will have had to address the habits and behaviors most likely to hold them back from moving to the next level, which is really what this book is about. They will have had to address a lot of those in order to be where they are. So they will no longer really identify with those. There are two exceptions, but we can talk about those later. But so I think, it's just we're human beings and we have a range of the habits that hold us back. But I will say, and this was one of the biggest surprises to me, as soon as the book came out, I started hearing from men who said, I really identify with habit 7, 9, 2, 3, whatever. So that to some extent surprised me. And as you may know, How Women Rise, this idea of habits and behaviors most likely to hold you back, really came from the insight of my co-author on this book, Marshall Goldsmith, who had written a wonderful book called What Got You Here Won't Get You There. And in that book, he looks at habits and behaviors most likely to hold successful people back. And when I read the book, I thought, this is wonderful. This is terrific. But the primary things that I see being a problem for women are not in here. So that's why I suggested to Marshall we collaborate on this book. But what has surprised me is how many men do identify with a number of these habits, some as many as 6 or 7 of them. And I think there again, it's often experience. If you're in a certain sector that prizes certain, if you're in a sector where you're not expected to do much self-promotion, then, men won't necessarily develop or emphasize that skill in the same way that women will. So what I've come to really think of this book, even though I know it has special application for women, is a book that looks at the habits and behaviors that Marshall left out of What Got You Here Won't Get You There. So it sort of completes that.
And let's dive into the specifics of the book, Sally. Very early on, you talk about how women often respond differently to 360 than men. And one of the things I did while preparing for this conversation, Sally, was I said, let me not get biased by the way I see the situation or the way I've digested the book. So I asked a few women leaders who are friends to opine on the questions I should ask you. And actually, I want to read out one of the questions I got from one of them. And she says, on 360, while women respond differently, do they also get judged differently? She says, I've seen instances where similar outcomes and character traits get called out differently versus men. For example, demanding no-nonsense man boss is direct, while a similar situation with a woman can get her labeled as insensitive, aggressive, or even quote unquote bitchy. And if indeed there's a different baseline, how do women comprehend and act on 360 in the light of that? So I'd love to hear from you on how women should think about the 360.
Well, I think that the woman you interviewed makes a point that I have observed and witnessed for 30 years, and that serious researchers, including McKinsey in their Women Matter series that they began, brilliant research in 2008, and Catalyst and other researchers have noticed that the same characteristics in men get described differently from women often. I do think it's changing. I've watched that change, but it's still nowhere near where the assessment is similar. So there's, I think on one hand, there are two things going on. On one hand, I think it's harder for women to get accuracy in their 360s because of some of the judgment that comes in on exactly what you said, on being direct. She's too direct. What do you mean she's too direct? Oh, I don't know. She's aggressive. She's brusque. She's this, that, or the other. Whereas direct will be valued in a man. So I think there's some judgment there. But there's something else going on that I have witnessed. And this you won't find so much in the research, but I have seen it so many times. And that is 360s, women can tend to take them more to heart and to use them as an occasion to feel bad about themselves when they get any kind of negative evaluation, and to question themselves in a very thorough and not always terribly constructive ways. Whereas one of the things I've watched, and Marshall would back me up on this because we've had many conversations about it, is that often, especially with very successful men, when they get evaluations that they say don't agree with or don't like, they think the person got it wrong, or they get angry about it, or they say, it was a lousy test, or, it was bad questions, whatever. So that's the other thing that I think that there's on one hand, differences often that are getting less pronounced, but slowly, in how evaluations are done. But there's also a difference in how much men and women often take the results to heart.
And back to the earlier point you made, Sally, about some of these biases in the way the behaviors are noticed in men and women. Any messages for the men out there in terms of ensuring objectivity while delivering feedback to a woman specifically?
I think it's very helpful for men to be aware of this and to be able to catch themselves and really ask themselves hard questions when they hear themselves say things like, I think she's a little too aggressive. I think she's a little bit too direct, and try to figure out what that would look like in a way that they would think was positive. Because usually it's either you're too direct or I can't figure out what the heck she's saying. She's so indirect. And they're not leaving much of a space between. So I think it's very helpful. And I think this is one area we've made so much progress, I have to say. As someone who's been in this 30 years, it's really changed. And I think men are much more, in my observation, open to saying, I'm wondering if that might be an unconscious bias that I'm bringing into play here when I have that objection, and to stop and sort of question themselves with that quick evaluation. I see much more of that happening.
And you also talk about women thinking about ambition slightly different from men, and you say that there are different dimensions to it. Could you elaborate on the nuance here, Sally?
Yeah, I think that women often struggle with defining themselves as ambitious. And part of that is because they have seen women who are perceived of as being ambitious. They have seen them get so negatively tagged for it. And, you can go back. I mean, you can see someone running for president. Oh, she's so ambitious. Yeah, she's running for president. What do you think? Most people who are going to be running for president are going to be pretty ambitious. Women who are, in very high positions are often criticized. Well, they're so ambitious. They must not have any personal life or any home life, or, just be very difficult to be around. So I think that women often get kind of scared off from being seen as ambitious. And, in the book, one of the things I quote this psychiatrist on the Upper East Side of New York City, who worked with women who were mostly either very senior women in investment banking or very senior women in law firms. And she said that about 80% of the clients who come to see her in the first session say, I want you to know I'm not ambitious. Well, you don't get to be partner in a New York City top 10 law firm if you're not ambitious. It doesn't just fall into your lap. So it's that discomfort with being perceived of as ambitious, or the language around ambition. And I think that has inhibited women often from really developing, making the commitment to develop to their full potential.
And you also talk about the different dimensions around which they're ambitious in terms of some of the other domains of life and other interests. Could you expand on that, just for women to take note of what else could be called ambitious?
Yes, certainly. And I think that's again, that's changing a little bit. Women have always looked at ambition at work as being balanced or calibrated with being, to some degree, ambitious for the quality of their family life, ambitious for the relationships within their family, ambitious for the ability, to be a good family member, a good team player in a neighborhood association, recognized as, a good neighbor, a good contributor, good in a nonprofit role that they may take. So I think that women have often had a rather balanced way of viewing ambition as something you strive to have, you're ambitious to have a well-balanced life. And I think there wasn't that much room for men to do this in the past, but I certainly see that as beginning to change, whereas men are more likely to also articulate their own ambition in terms of the capacity, the launching they provide for their daughters, and the kinds of relationships that they have at home. So I think that's really changing slowly again, but in that way.
And one of the other leaders, women leaders, when they looked at this question or looked at this insight from you, they said, given that women often think about ambition in a little more of a holistic manner beyond just work, there's a reasonable chance that they end up finding the true north probably more often than men. Do you see the two connected? And empirically or anecdotally, do you have a view on women finding the true north in life more frequently than men?
I think that women have more awareness of wanting to find their true north, because men will often feel that they don't have much of a choice, that they've just got to, get the best job they can and go for it and make it a success. And they don't have the options. And women will be more likely to think, they'll want to ask themselves, am I really enjoying the quality of my days? Do I feel that I am making the best contribution with my talents? Am I making the world a better place through what I'm doing? I find women very avid to ask these questions, even at a midpoint in their career. Whereas I think in the past, that's been tough for men, unless they're in, a position of great privilege, to feel that they even, have the option to ask that question, because they just have to, buckle down and do what they and do whatever they do. And sort of, as Marshall would say, they have to suck it up rather than using it as an opportunity to really think about, how is this serving me? How is it serving the world? How is this aligning with my purpose? So I think we're now at a time in the workplace where there's a lot of language around that, around purpose, around meaning, etc. And I know that it's often considered to be something millennials brought into the workplace. But having been on the track I've been for the last 30 years, my observation is that women kind of got there first. There were more women thinking in those terms. Women sort of pioneered that idea that, really we need to look at work in the larger context, holistically, as you say, about meaning and purpose in life. It's an element of that. And I think that sort of opened up permission for people to look at that. And now it's something that men and women are both much more comfortable with.
And if I may persist with that, Sally, what do you think is driving the change among the men? Millennials definitely probably are one factor. Any other factors you think that are driving this slow change in men over time?
Yes, a couple things. One, I think, is that, again, having watched this up close for so long, how we define excellence in leadership in organizations has really shifted over the last 30, 35 years. In the 80s, for example, which was really the last period when women had virtually nothing to do with leadership, the idea of a leader was, execution, performance. Somebody's got to be tough. You've got to, make your numbers, drive everybody else to make numbers. And, we had some of these. I remember Fortune magazine used to have an annual issue called America's Toughest Leader. And it was a profile of a man who seemed like he was the most difficult person on the planet to work for. And the sort of underlying theme was always, you got to be tough. Of course, I do want to say that one thing I got to watch was how most of those men actually ended up driving their companies, if not into the ground, into very serious, serious problems later on. But it was, just sort of how we thought of leadership in a corporate setting. And that has changed. And I think part of it has been the participation of women, but a big part of it has been the change in the nature of technology to be much more interactive and networked and web-like and naturally, to some extent, inclusive. So I think the technology has shaped what we expect from leaders, and also the nature of the economy, the switch to more of a knowledge economy where knowledge is distributed more broadly. So the top dog leader can't be expected ever to know everything because there's so much knowledge distributed through companies. So through the 90s and early 2000s, you really began to get a different way of looking at what constituted excellence in leadership. And, Peter Drucker wrote about it. Someone like Tom Peters certainly wrote about it. And I think that, kind of beautifully, there was a confluence between what women were bringing and that larger change that has served women well, has served organizations well, and has helped bring forth more and more men who are thoughtful, reflective, self-aware, and humble leaders than would have ever been possible 30 or 40 years ago.
This is your host Deepak Jayaraman here. I'm reminded of my conversation with Professor Stuart Friedman of Wharton, who speaks about 4 domains of life that we all should think about: work, home, community, and self. Not necessarily in that order. Out of these 4, I find that work and home are often well understood. So I asked Stu when he was on the podcast what he meant by the other 2, community and self. And here's what he said.
So the community piece, just to answer your question about like, what is that and how is it relevant? some people struggle with that. And I often get questions about, well, what is community and why does that matter? Community captures kind of everything outside of you and your work and your family. So that includes your network of friends and neighbors, people in the place where you live. But it could also include people that you are engaged with in some kind of political group or religious group. So that usually has some meaning for most people. It may not be the most important thing. For some people it is. And the self, of course, is who are you as an individual, in your own private sphere, the things that matter to your physical health, your mental health and emotional growth, and your spiritual life, which it is important to some people and not to others. But these aspects of our existence are, for most people, pretty important. So these four buckets, if you will, seem to capture most of our experience. And it's also simple. There's not 12 categories, there's just four. And last point about this, I ask people to define these domains of their lives in ways that make sense to them. So there's no rigid definition that I impose, but rather it's a device to help you to think about the differentiated parts of your life, and that helps you make sense of how to bring them together. In order to make sense of the whole, you've got to see what the parts are. And so people make their own decisions, choices about, well, what does home mean to me? How do I define family? And the way you define it might be different than the way I define it, and et cetera. So it's useful in that way that everything about this approach is subjectively defined by the learner, the user.
Back to what Sally says, very often we think about ambition only in the context of work, but it's worth having a holistic view of the various domains of life and having a calibrated ambition that can serve us in the long game of life. Let's now get back to the conversation with Sally Helgesen. And moving on, Sally, you talk about women struggling with accepting credit when somebody compliments them on a good performance. And I specifically love the insight you share from Marshall, where he says, just say thank you and put a full stop and say nothing more. And I found that so simple yet, so hard. And you go on to say that the cost of claiming recognition rises significantly as you move through the ranks. And once again, when I shared this question with a few women leaders, one of them came back and said, how much of this accepting credit challenge is housed in a wider prevalence of the imposter syndrome among women? And how does one go after the root cause? So could you talk a little bit about this notion of accepting credit and how that shows up with women?
Yes, I do think that the woman you spoke with was really very correct in locating some of this in the imposter syndrome. That when you have some reservations about how much you fit in or how much you belong, then when you receive a compliment about how you did something very, really made a real contribution, that you're more likely to say, oh, no, it wasn't me, or, well, my team is great. I was just, I was just doing my job, or something like that, rather than, as Marshall said, just a simple thank you. I appreciate that. So I think that the imposter syndrome does certainly play a role. Other things play a role as well. I think that women are often raised to be, modest and humble, and those are good qualities. I'm not saying they're not. They're very, very good qualities. But when they manifest as a kind of false modesty and an inability to accept a well-meant compliment, they don't do anybody a favor. Why contradict someone who says something nice to you? It doesn't really seem like, a terrific idea. So I think that is often at play as well.
And could you bring that to life, Sally? This point around just thank you and nothing more. You shared a couple of examples in the book where there's a temptation to to sort of maybe downplay the accomplishment or to sort of deflect. Could you maybe bring it to life with a couple of examples for the listeners to relate to?
Oh, certainly. I mean, where I see it most often is, where somebody will say, oh, you really did a great job on that. Well, it was my team. Okay. You know what? Yes, it was your team. And then you'll talk to the woman and say, why did you say that? She'll say, well, it was the team. We work as a team. Yes, but it's not an either or. It is not an either or. You always can say, thank you. I had an excellent team. This is what I contributed. That is a very important thing to be able to say, because every one of us needs to get visibility for our achievements. In my experience, great careers are built on 3 legs: visibility, connections, and expertise. And we always need to keep those balanced. So we want to create a situation where we are comfortable claiming and accepting visibility for what we've contributed and recognizing that that does not necessarily take it away from other people, but it's something we can share, but we want to be clear about what our role is, or we will get lost in the shuffle.
And moving forward, Sally, in the book, you refer to Anna Fels and her book, Necessary Dreams.
Yes.
You say that feeling fulfilled at work requires 2 things, according to her: recognition and mastery. And when women don't get enough of the former, which is recognition, they dig deeper into mastery, and that can come in the way of assuming a wider span of responsibility. Could you expand on this nuance here again?
Oh, yes. That's such a brilliant insight from Anna Fels in that great book, Necessary Dreams, which has extraordinary research. And that's what she talks about, that a real contribution at work is always a combination. You need to be recognized, but you need to also feel that you are mastering skills. And the framework I put this in has to do with what I just said about a great career being built on 3 legs: visibility, connections, and expertise. Recognition depends on visibility. So if you don't have the capacity to create visibility for what you're contributing, it's going to be very difficult for people to recognize what you do. So what women will often do as a default is they'll overvalue expertise or mastery. They'll say, okay, it's part of that habit number 2, which is the most popular one in the book, I have to say, expecting others to spontaneously notice and value your contributions. You're reluctant to bring attention to them, so you hope other people notice. They often don't notice because they're busy with something else. Then you start to feel bad because you put in so much effort and haven't been recognized. So you try to solve that problem by working harder and harder and harder, which kind of digs you in further, because what you really need to be addressing is a visibility factor, not the expertise factor. In other language, what you need to be addressing is the recognition, your ability to get recognized for what you do, as opposed to just constantly pursuing mastery.
And in the notion of self-promotion, you also talk a little bit about getting the tone right, the healthy self-promotion, not to go over the top, at the same time not staying silent. Any wisdom there on getting that balance right?
Yeah, first of all, is accepting it's not an either or. It's not either you're the obnoxious person taking up all the air in the room and constantly talking about how great you are, or you just hang back and expect and hope other people notice what your contribution are. There's always a middle ground. But in finding it, there are many different ways to do that. The example I just gave, thank you. Our team did a great job. This is what I contributed. There are many different ways to do that. But the most important, and I always say this to the clients and the women that I work with, is a successful way of doing that is always needs to come from you. So start practicing. Don't try to figure out in advance, okay, I've got to find the exact perfect way of doing this. So on one hand, I don't seem as if I'm, overly self-promoting, but on the other hand, I make sure people know what I did. Instead of trying to find the perfect way in advance, just start doing it. You'll make mistakes. Sometimes you'll be a little over the top. Sometimes you'll sit back a bit. And, but you'll learn by doing. It's very hard to just do it all in your head and then turn on a dime and suddenly become very skillful with it. And if you're not sure, ask other people. Say, I'm going in this meeting. I really am very eager to present, to let people know about the success that I had with this, whatever it was, the initiative, whatever I did. I'm very excited. I really feel like I need to make people aware. It'll be helpful to them in doing their job to know what I've contributed. But I'm a little bit, I'm not used to doing this. Would you just watch me and let me know? Do you think that the way that I presented this worked, that it was appropriate, that it landed right, that I found the right tone? So ask other people, because you can't always judge for yourself. So again, not going through trying to find the perfect way in advance in your head and then try it out, but start trying and start asking.
And back to the three pillars of a good career you spoke about, Sally, one of them being connections. And in the book, you talk about the distinction between building great relationships and leveraging relationships. And you say that women often build great relationships, but sometimes don't do enough to leverage them. What's your advice, again, for women to do this without coming across as transactional?
Yeah, I think that it's very important not to do this in a transactional way. It's really important to leverage people in your career and to be a point of leverage for other people. It's that creates that give and take around which successful careers are built, and is a key part of organizations really being able to do things too, is people leveraging one another's skills, resources, connections, and ideas. So that needs to be something that you're committed to doing. What's interesting, there are a couple of things that are interesting. One is that because I started doing some research on, what are the most effective ways to engage and leverage other people to help you and to be a resource for them. What is least effective is a real quid pro quo approach, which was surprising to me. So what's least effective is saying, hey, I'm going to help you. I really need help with getting some connections in this field. And if you help me, then I will be glad to get you connections in this field or make a recommendation to you. So when you try to frame it as a quid pro quo, as, well, you do this for me, I'll do that for you, it takes away some of the joy that the other person can have in actually helping you. And research demonstrates that the number one reason people help other people is because it makes them feel better about themselves. So when you frame it as a quid pro quo, you take away that ability for the other person who's helping you to feel better about themselves. The other thing is when you want to engage somebody to help you with something, say it's some connections you need, or say it's access to resources, or whatever it is, you want to be as specific as you can about the request. Sometimes if we're inexperienced at doing it or we feel uncomfortable, we kind of fudge it and say, hey, I'm kind of wondering, I'm wondering if you might be able to give me a little bit of help on, and then you say something kind of vague. The more specific you are, the more clear you are, the more helpful they will be. The more helpful they can be, they'll have, I could really help her with that, as opposed to just trying to get them to sort of read your mind. So you want to be specific. It's also good to give a time frame so the person doesn't feel like, well, if I help her on this, does it mean I'm going to be helping her with that for the rest of my life? Really wondering if you could help in this time frame, me, get access to whatever it is. That's a very good thing to do. And to approach it really as a win-win. I think that one thing I've noticed, well, there are a lot of very successful women who are superb leveragers. Men who are successful are virtually always superb at leveraging and engaging other people. And the ones who are most effective, they really do tend to see it as a win-win. They do tend to see, I'm asking you to do this for me. I'm asking you to be a resource for me in this way. And they really do see now we have a relationship where I can be a resource for you, and that's going to be to your advantage as well. So it's partly, I think of it as seeing yourself as a player, as somebody who can be instrumental in helping other people build their careers as well. That's what makes you comfortable doing.
And when you look at this, I was trying to remember Adam Grant's research around givers, takers, and matchers.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see a difference in distribution for men and women in terms of how they distribute into the three categories, or do you see that as largely gender agnostic?
I have not really thought of that. I think it's a very interesting question. I think that the goal is that we all want to be more effective matchers in Grant's language. That is, not someone who's always giving in the hope that someday someone will give back to us, which is often futile if we're unclear about what we need or want, or even the fact that we do want something. And then, I don't think anybody really benefits over the long run by being a taker. But we want to be a matcher. That is, we want to sort of match what our asks and what our offers are to the colleagues and peers that we build and leverage and help ourselves along the way. So I think that's really what we're aiming at. We're all aiming at a better, a sort of more skillful approach to being matchers.
This is your host Deepak Jayaraman here. Sally's insight reminds me of something I learned from Herminia Ibarra, one of the earlier guests of the show. She speaks about three kinds of networks: operational, personal, and strategic. Herminia says that operational networks are what get the job done today. Personal networks have a certain emotional quality to them and consist of relatives, friends, and so on. But she goes on to say that strategic networks are the ones that provide breakthroughs and advanced careers. And very often, we're not intentional about these networks, either because we don't make the time or we aren't deliberate enough.
One example that struck my eye a couple of years ago, is the one that's first coming to my mind, is when Beth Comstock was still at GE as Chief Marketing Officer. She felt that she was oftentimes much more connected to the outside world than most people in operational jobs at GE, which tended to be more internally focused. And so she felt, even though it wasn't part of the job description, that a part of what she could do is bring the outside in for those people. And the example that I loved is she was at a book talk in Silicon Valley for the launch of The Lean Startup by Eric Ries about fast prototyping, which originally was a book written for startups. How do you go to scale quickly, minimum viable prototype? But she just thought, we're taking too long in our product development. Our turbines are taking too long to develop. And I bet we could use some of these ideas in a more classic manufacturing context. Let me make the connections. And she did. And a big part of GE Aviation then got trained on these methods to kind of make the process more agile. So that for me is a great example of how you can be strategic. You've got access to something others don't. And so you see the idea here and the need there, and you bring them together.
Over the last few years, I've started realizing the value of the power of weak ties, going back to the 1973 study by Mark Granovetter. We often think that opportunities come from our strong ties, but I've personally noticed that they often come from our weak links. I heard somebody explain elegantly why this phenomenon might be at play. That's possibly because the strong ties are possibly close to our ecosystems and we see similar opportunities as them. So the net add to the world of possibilities is limited. But when it comes to weak ties, the Venn diagram of the world of opportunities as they see and what we see has lesser overlap, leading to a greater surface area of opportunities, if that makes sense. As Sally says, I guess it's a combination of building the right kinds of relationships and establishing the right tonality of mutual value add in these connections. Thank you for listening. If this topic is of interest, you might like the curated playlist on women leadership that has insights from several women leaders on what it takes to unlock the potential of women at the workplace. Please go to playtopotential.com, go to the tab Curated Playlists, and then look up Women Leadership. If you find the podcast purposeful, do rate and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever else you consume this content. We have an update at the podcast. We've recently started making some of the nuggets from the podcast archives available through WhatsApp. Do message +91 85914 52129 with your name, number, and email. Let's now get back to Sally. And changing topics, Sally, you talk about the phenomenon where men and women are seen differently when they are evaluated for a role. And the way I read it was that men often end up being assessed for leadership potential, while women are assessed for performance.
Yes.
And you actually go on to say, on the other hand, women also end up prioritizing their current job over their career. And I like the pithy language. Could you talk a little bit about how this phenomenon plays out, and therefore what's the implication for both men and women in ensuring that this bias is avoided?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, in terms of the evaluation, men being assessed for potential and women being assessed based on their contributions, there's a lot of research that backs that up, that men tend to get assessed as, he's a real potential leader. And it's not even necessarily based on something that he's done, but on the perception that he, carries himself like a leader, or, has a personality or operating style that's like a previous male leader, that sort of thing. So that's a very common thing that happens. Whereas especially if you are in an organization or culture where there haven't been that many women leaders, it's often, you just fall back on judging women based solely on what their performance has been, not on what you think they could contribute strategically, because you haven't really thought in that frame or had experience with it. So I think that can be problematic for women often, and was sort of an inherent problem in that 90s and or really early 2000 obsession with high potentials, sorting out who's a high potential, who's not a high potential. Before anybody had ever even done anything, you kind of decided this person was and that person wasn't. So I think that has often, to some degree, disadvantaged women. It's a little bit different than the habit about putting your job before your career, which is something that I have noticed. And I think it was really one of the most popular, if I could say, or the most endorsed habits in the book that so many women identify with, where you pour your energies into the job you have, feeling that if you do the best job that you can at the job you have, that will translate into being rewarded, so that you will be the person who is chosen for a promotion or whatever. And guess what? It often doesn't work that way. And the reason it doesn't work that way is because of the two other legs of the, successful career: visibility and connections. You value your job, so you're putting all your energy, all your time, all your skill, all your effort, all your learning into doing the best job that you can. So you're underinvesting in building those relationships and gaining the visibility that you need. And so you're not promoted. Someone else is promoted who has perhaps done a more balanced job of courting visibility and of building connections. And then it feels very, very disappointing to you. And you feel like, well, wait a minute, how come I didn't get that promotion? I did the best job. It may have been that you were overvaluing what your job was. It also, there's a loyalty element there. Research demonstrates that women tend to see themselves as more loyal and put a higher premium on being loyal to the people around them. And that part of over-investing in your job at the expense of your career is showing that you are loyal. And I know I've worked with numerous women who've said things like, my boss has really believed in me, so I'm not going to talk about, what I would like to do next, because then my boss is going to see me as being disloyal. Now, your boss didn't get where he or she got by only doing the job they were doing and not thinking about what the next step might be. And so they understand the realities. And if you're a smart person who really believes you have something to contribute, then you probably want to take the next step in your career. And it's not a great idea to pretend as if you don't, because you think you're going to get loyalty points for that. So I know that I've worked with women directly. I remember a woman at a technology company in Boston, and her boss actually said to her, I was going to recommend you for this other position that came up. He said, but I realized you are invaluable and I don't know how we could lose you. So I didn't. And she said she actually felt very good about that, him saying that to her for a number of months. And then she thought, well, wait a minute. If that's true, does that mean I'm going to be in this job forever? And she decided she had to take some initiative. So the next time there was a listing that came up in the company for a job she really wanted, she took that listing, she walked into his office and said, here is a job that I would really love to have. And I would love your support in thinking about how to potentially position myself for it. And he said, of course, you've done a wonderful job here. So, that really surprised her, because she thought he was going to think, oh, she's so disloyal. She's only been here 11 years doing the same job. So I think there's a little more of that thinking, in any case, two things. In any job you're in, think about it. Of course, you want to do a good job. You're never going to get anywhere if you don't do a good job. But how do you see this as leading to something else? And then once you have a clear picture of that, talk about it a little bit, not incessantly, but talk about, I'm really hoping, and go into somebody who's in a position of power and say, I'm really hoping this job might translate as to such and such. Do you have any suggestions? Are there any skills you think I could acquire or areas for improvement? Any connections that would be useful for me to build in order to get to that next place. So coming out with it, being to some degree direct and clear about it is a powerful thing to do.
And as I read that insight, Sally, I was also wondering how this dynamic plays out with couples, working couples, where, if we go with the observation that you make about men being assessed for potential and possibly being career-oriented, while women being assessed for performance and being the current role oriented, there's sort of one path leads to growth and the other path leads to stagnation. Do you see that phenomenon playing out on the personal front in the way dynamics play out?
Where I see it in dual career couples is often a very healthy synthesis whereby each person becomes the other person's real champion. So I have heard this so many times when I do a program and I'm talking about putting your job before your career. I cannot tell you how many women come up to me and say, this is what my husband tells me I've been doing. Exactly what you're saying, that I need to think of this more in a career context and that I need to talk more about it. So what I get from that is their husbands are encouraging them and sort of giving them some help on that, which is something that in many, certainly not all cases, men are a little bit more comfortable with. So that's a very, very good thing. And I think that that's one way. And, obviously there are ways in which women can help men to be more articulate about what their skills are, what their, how a given job fits into their larger sense of meaning and purpose, and can help them develop, more sensitivity and all kinds of things. But I think that can be a very positive thing in a dual career couple. We learn from each other, and we learn, from each partner sharing strengths and insights in a very helpful way.
Sally, moving to a different theme, you allude to the perfection trap and the disease to please as the two big reasons that come in the way of women rising. Could you expand on these two phenomena and how it plays out for women?
Certainly. These are really important habits to be aware of, because they really are the two habits that are the most toxic at a leadership level and the most pervasive at a leadership level. Many of the habits in the book, like reluctance to claim your achievements or minimizing or, too much, which is too much information, too much background, too many details, too much disclosure. Many of those kinds of habits, by the time a woman will get to a more senior level, she will have worked her way around those, putting your job before your career. But what is remarkable is to find the extent to which the perfection trap and the disease to please can still linger at very senior levels, and the extreme difficulties that they cause, especially with the perfection trap. I will say that in my experience, when a woman who has extraordinary talents and a lot to offer and has worked very, very hard does not make it to a senior position where it looks like you would expect her to make it, usually perfectionism is somewhere involved. And why is perfectionism, for example, so toxic when you get to a position of greater influence, authority, and scope? It's because if you're a perfectionist, you're going to have a very hard time delegating. And as your scope enlarges, the more you need to delegate. It's because if you're a perfectionist, you are going to have a much harder time, not being in judgment of other people and where they fall short. And that's going to have a more negative impact the higher that you go. But probably the primary reason that being perfectionist, and by perfectionist, I mean believing you're either doing everything perfectly or you're failing. There's no middle ground. You are either you did everything right and you kind of got through that, or, you messed something up and therefore you really blew it. So the reason that that's so problematic at a senior level is you create a tremendous amount of stress. You create a lot of stress for yourself in a way that really makes doing your job and doing it well unsustainable, because you put yourself under so much stress and tension. And you create a lot of stress for other people, for the people around you. And I always say this, but I've been doing what I've been doing for over 30 years, and I have never once ever heard anybody say, I work for a perfectionistic boss and I love it. No one does. No one has a good experience with that. So even as you're trying to make everything work and pouring your heart and soul into trying to be perfect, you're creating a stress that undermines yourself and others in terms of being able to reach their full potential. Two other things at a leadership level that are problematic with perfection is you can become chronically risk averse. because if everything has to be done perfectly, you can't take risks or try something different because it might not turn out perfectly. So that limits really your ability to learn, because we all really learn from making mistakes. And the other thing is you sort of identify yourself as a micro thinker as opposed to a big picture thinker because you're focused on the details and getting everything right. So lots of problems with perfectionism at the top.
And you go on to say, Sally, that this is possibly a generation where parents, women included, are spending a lot of time on their child compared to previous generations. And at the same time, we have a lot of women entering the workforce in large numbers. And you talk about this double whammy, which has a significant implication on women. So I was curious about, the takeaways for women at one level, but also systemically, how should we think about making it easier to provide for childcare to ensure we have more women leaders?
Well, that's an issue. The solutions for that really lie either at an organizational level or at a national level, and different countries will solve that problem differently. And really, this book has a very global scope, as I think you know. We're in 18 languages, and so I'm not making any recommendations in terms of childcare. What I was talking about there more was that there is an intensity to parenting in contemporary society that did not exist 30, 40, 50 years ago. And part of it probably has to do with people having smaller families. I came from a family of 5 kids. I went to Catholic school growing up in the Midwest. People in my class their families had between 4 and 12 children. So it was very common to have these big families. So parents couldn't be worried about every single thing that ever happened to their child because there was just too many of them. That's very different now. People get very involved with everything that pertains to their children. And in so many ways, that's a good thing. It just gives children more support. It's a much more complex environment that they're going out into. So that's a very good thing. And I'm certainly not finding any kind of fault with that at all. But I am noticing that we have evolved probably the most time-intensive style of parenting in human history at the very time that women are playing a much more active role in the workforce and as leaders, and that makes things extremely intense for women and often creates a layer of guilt that is not useful. Let me just put it that way, not useful. Feeling as if
and we're not even talking COVID, right?
No, we're not even talking
pre-COVID.
Yeah, I remember sitting next to a woman who was at one of the top artificial intelligence women at Google out in Silicon Valley. She was actually from India. And she was telling me how in her neighborhood in Silicon Valley, it's so competitive, the kind of birthday parties that 4, 5, and 6-year-olds have. They take 6 months of planning. And just, she was trying to get off of that without her children feeling as if they were the least cared for children in the neighborhood, because it was such a wildly time-consuming situation. And she said, what's really strange about it is that a lot of these are dual career couples where the women have big, important jobs, and they're, spending 6 months of, major logistical and strategic planning around a 4-year-old's birthday party. She said, it's kind of inconceivable. That's what I'm talking about.
Got it. And maybe just given its topical COVID, right? That's changed the intensity to a different level, right? In terms of taking care of the online schooling, taking care of the kids 24 hours. Earlier, they were away for a while. How has that impacted men and women differently? Do you have maybe it's too early for detailed research, but do you have anecdotal insight into how it's impacting men and women differently?
Yes, I do. And I think it's really important that we distinguish between the short-term impact of COVID, which is for parents so much, and disproportionately for mothers, so much about the difficulty of homeschooling, the difficulty of having a child at home all the time, not able to be in play groups, not able to go to daycare, not able to have, people in the house to help care for the child, maybe not being able to have the grandparents in the house carrying the child. This is a extremely challenging situation for parents. It's been especially challenging for women, and at least in the United States is correlated with some declines in female participation in the labor force over the last 14, 15 months, which I do also think is related to the fact that women are disproportionately represented in retail and hospitality, which are probably the two most impacted sectors. So that's also, that's COVID related, but it's not to minimize the challenge of that. It's been an enormous challenge, and it's been terribly, terribly difficult for many. However, I do think that there's also the side coming out of COVID, the switch to the acceptance of so many leaders of how effective virtual and flexible work can be, that is going to be over time an enormous advantage for women. Two examples. One, I was speaking with a head of HR at a client who's an energy company here in the U.S., in the South, in the Southern U.S., quite conservative company. And she said, this is going to be incredible. She said, we have had so much difficulty hiring women because we're very inflexible about anything to do with work from home. And we don't give any allowance for people, their children's sick day, et cetera. She said, women who have choices just don't want to work for us. And she said, now our leadership sees that our productivity has not been impacted by this at all. So they're becoming believers in it. She said, and I think this is going to make a big impact in terms of our ability to attract women. I was also struck, I read a long interview with the chair of Tata Corp, Mumbai-based, in Financial Times. This was probably about 7 or 8 months ago, maybe even earlier. I think it was last spring, fairly early in the pandemic. And he was saying that what this is going to do is to dramatically increase the pace of flexible work hours and virtual work. He said that he anticipated that Tata would be 70% people working from home by the end of this decade, by 2029. And I thought that was really fascinating because although there are challenges in that, as long as you have children who are in school and can either have daycare or people if they're very young children, in the home helping with them, that is a very good option often for parents, certainly having some flexibility around it. So I think that in the long run, this is going to be a big plus for women and for parents in general.
That's a great insight. A lot of the mindsets around what it takes to be effective at work have fundamentally shifted in the last 12 months, and maybe that's an opportunity to level the playing field.
It really is. I was just reading a piece of research today from ADPRI, I think it's called. Marcus Buckingham is associated with it. It was a whole analysis of some engagement surveys that they had done. And the biggest surprise to me in reading this engagement survey is they showed people who are part of teams have higher engagement than people who aren't. But people who are part of virtual teams had actually higher engagement than people who were part of teams where they met on an ongoing basis. And that was a big surprise to the researchers and a big surprise to me. So I think there are more surprises like that out there. And certainly in terms of, many organizations, there was a challenge for women with children in terms of travel requirements for executive positions. And that's one of I can speak from my own experience. That's one of the absolute best things about the experience, horrible and painful as it has been, that we've been through over the last 14 months, is this sort of reevaluation of the role of business travel. And that's another thing I think that's going to be equal, level of playing field.
That's a great insight. And moving themes, Sally, I wanted to talk about communication. And I was surprised, actually, to read that there's research which suggests that women are known to speak about 20,000 words a day on average compared to men who speak around 7,000 words on average. Of course, I'm sure there's a spectrum in both situations. But I guess where I was going with this was, as women and men rise, the talk-listen ratio changes as you sort of evolve into a leader. So I was curious, when we think of executive presence, is there a nuance to the way women should think about it compared to men? I guess I'm mixing two questions here, but if you could expand this notion of how communication applies to men and women and how they should find their own authentic style in developing their presence.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. I mean, first of all, the 20,000 versus 7, it's very helpful to think of it. And it's generally true. I think the research was US based, and I would imagine it plays out some differently to different degrees in different cultures. But what the way that I was using it in the book was talking about, the importance of developing a really concise and clear mode of communication, that especially for women, it helps men who are in positions of influence and authority to really hear you. And my mind goes back to a woman I spent some time with who was the leading operations person in one of the world's largest pharmaceutical companies. And she had been a medical doctor before. And I asked her, what do you think is responsible for your rapid rise in this organization? And she surprised me by saying, I really think what it is I had to learn in my medical practice to be very concise in delivering often very important information to people. Because there wasn't that much time. The appointments are not that long anymore. And she said, and that really served me well here because we have a kind of male tone, as she put it, in this pharmaceutical company and in the sector, she said, where very crisp and concise communications are valued. And she said, and I saw that there are a lot of really talented women here who just use too many words, and that some of the senior men lose patience and some of their male colleagues can't figure out what they're talking about because there's just a lot of words coming at them. And she said, so what I've tried to do is really make myself a resource for coaching a lot of our extremely talented women to be more concise and to develop more of that, concise leadership tone, being very careful. Now, let's talk about it from the point of view of authenticity, because, on one hand, that's an important observation, but does it sound like what I'm recommending is that women try to talk like men? No, not at all. But in my experience, the most effective leaders are very, very aware of the outsized value every single word they use has. When you're in a position of leadership, people listen to everything you say and try to discern clues about what it might mean or what the hidden message might be for them or what you really want. That's where people's minds are. And the most effective leaders I know are very aware of this. So they are careful in their communications. That doesn't mean they're censoring themselves, but it means that they recognize what they say really has weight. And so they tend to not be quite as profligate, maybe we could say, with words, because they understand that the more words you use, the more potential ground there may be for misunderstanding. And they treat their communications with real respect and seriousness because they know how much impact they will have. So that's where I think that looking at it in terms of authenticity is probably not the most helpful thing. What's the most helpful thing? Thinking, how can I be as clear as possible? And I know that as a writer, I deal with I have big audiences, but I deal with a lot of complicated topics around leadership and, technology, nature of the economy, etc. So my goal in everything I write is I want it to be as clear as possible. And I find that when you're in a position of authority, when people are listening to you, that's a good goal to strive for. Not how can I be the most authentic? How can I be really me? Or what's my tone? Try to be as clear as you can. Not redundantly, not repeating over and over, but being as clear as you can the first time. And your tone will evolve naturally from that, is what I find.
And in the limited research I've done and the conversations I've had, Sally, I understand that maternity is a place where there's significant leakage in the pipeline of women rising to the top. Yes. In your experience, would you agree, number one? And number two, would you see any other points of significant drop-off where women sort of move away from the pipeline? And any guidance, especially for women, through some of these phases of transition?
Yes, certainly maternity is historically a place where there develops a kind of leak, if you will, in the pipeline, in that, especially after a second or a third child, where it just suddenly, a woman will say, I need to take a step back. That doesn't mean she's going to drop out of the workforce, but I need to take a step back. I may not need to accept this next promotion if I want to keep all these, balls in the air. And that can slow a woman's progress down. But you know what? Careers today are much longer than they used to be. And, even slowing down for 5, 7 years is not the career killer that it would have been in the industrial economy, especially given that, people are hired today for their knowledge and their skills. So that those, as long as your technology skills, as long as you keep up with that, your knowledge and thus your value often increase. So it's not that big a deal to worry about. There's also a very common phenomenon where the pipeline gets leaky just before the senior leadership level. And that's something that's a little more challenging, I think, to address. In my experience over these many decades, what I view as the most common reason for that is that women will often get right up close to a senior position. So they're at a point where they can see what the lives of the person who hold that position are actually like. And they'll often say to themselves, I don't think that's worth it. And in fact, almost every time I have interviewed a woman who has left a job or made a lateral move away from a job at a very senior level, what she eventually at some point says is, I decided it just wasn't worth it. And that means that the personal toll it looked like it took was too much. And often that's because they're looking at someone who has an unbalanced approach to life and has thrown absolutely everything into the self-identification with the role and the position that usually it's a he will have, and that they don't want that for themselves. But there are many, many ways to avoid that. And so when I'm working with clients, I always urge them to not make those kinds of judgments, but to say, let me give this a try. Let me see if I can make this work for me in a way that would be satisfying, where I feel like I'm able to make a contribution, where I'm able to have a meaningful life, where I'm able to balance a range of responsibilities. Let me see if I can do that, rather than looking at some guy in a position and saying, well, his life looks awful to me, so no thank you. Because it's often a superficial judgment that really has more to do with that individual.
This is your host Deepak Jayaraman here. One of my earlier guests, Rupa Kudva, former MD of CRISIL and current country head of Omidyar Network in India, has a slightly different take on the point Sally makes. While Sally refers to women coming close to the top, asking themselves the question, is it worth it? Rupa talks about the notion of self-belief that sometimes comes on the way.
The second barrier that women hit is later on, when they are in the upper end of middle management or in senior management. But when it comes to them taking the top jobs, I feel that there it's a mental barrier of self-belief that I can and I should ask for the top jobs and I can do it. I think women hold back. They hold back in asking for a seat at the table. And I think that is where other women leaders can play a very big role. My own thinking on this has evolved in the last 15 years. If you had asked me this 15 years ago, I would have said it's all about merit. And, if you do good work, you will be recognized. Women don't need special treatment, is the argument that I would have made. Today, I believe that the second barrier that I talked about is a very big barrier, and therefore, it is actually almost incumbent on other women leaders to reach out and talk about this issue and help other women to cross this barrier.
For more, you might find the playlist Women Leadership of interest. Just go to playtopotential.com, go to curated playlists, and you will find women leadership as part of that. Multiple women leaders share their perspectives on what it takes for women to succeed. Let's now get back to Sally. And another related question here, Sally, when I sent this list of questions to my friends, one of them is a partner in an advisory services firm. And she sort of looked at the list and said, it seems like the only way to break the glass ceiling is to exhibit behaviors, that play by club rules. Shouldn't we aspire to change the game rather than just play the game based on existing rules? I know it's a provocatively worded comment, but any commentary around how women could think about changing the game, as they say, rather than, fine-tuning their approach to conform to the current game that's being played?
In my experience, that is exactly what has happened over the last 30 years. I think that women have been instrumental in changing the way the game is played. And what I spoke about earlier, that we have really redefined how we perceive of excellence in leadership. I think that has been in part because women have brought a broader perspective. I have not seen that many women who have achieved extraordinary things who said, well, I just looked at it and I decided I was going to play by the rules and just do everything the way the guys are doing it. I haven't seen that much, at least in the last 20 years. You'd hear that somewhat in the 90s, and it was probably, there weren't many alternatives, but I haven't seen that. I think that particularly today, when what organizations are looking for are people who have great human skills, who are effective communicators with people across levels, when organizations are looking for people who are capable of motivating employees who have a significant knowledge base so that they can most effectively harness that knowledge base. And I think when organizations are really especially looking for people who can increase the capacity for creativity and innovation within the organization, I think that you really get few points by just saying, okay, I see this is a club and I'm going to play by the rules. No, I think women have been instrumental in beginning to change how organizations function and operate in the world because they haven't gone along with that. So that's, I think that's something that's been happening for some time.
Mm-hmm. And changing topics, Sally, I have two young kids. I have a girl who's 11 and a boy who's 7.
Yes.
And I realize a lot of what you say in the book are actually deeply wired mindsets, both with men and women. So I'm curious what advice you would have for parents in the way they bring up boys and girls so that we have, more women leaders in the future.
I think that they can benefit by trying to help their boys be better listeners, that is an essential skill for rising together, for achieving their own best while helping women and the rest of the world achieve it as well. So I think they can emphasize listening skills to their boys, which I see often are, to some extent disregarded. I think that certainly for girls, it doesn't help female children to be complimented by saying, oh, that's perfect, you did a perfect job, etc., because it gives them that idea, that mental clue, oh, this is what being good at something is. It means that I have to be perfect at it. So I think there's some really good modeling we can do. I want to share a quick little story that was from an event that I was working at a great tech company out in Silicon Valley right before the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
And afterwards, a young woman came up to me and she said, I have a thing in the book where I, trying to let go of worrying and rumination. And I put up a sign in my office that says, oh, well, to remind myself to have a kind of a let it go attitude. And she said, that was the most helpful thing I read in the book. She said, and I'm a real ruminator. That's one of the behaviors in the book. She said, so I find that it's really helpful for me to put up little stickies all over my house that say, oh, well, oh, well, oh, well, to remind myself. So when things happen, I'll go, oh, well, oh, well. She said, well, I just want to tell you this. She said, a couple days ago, my 3-year-old daughter came into the kitchen and she was carrying a big bowl of Jell-O and she tripped on the door sill and the Jell-O went all over the kitchen floor. And she just looked up at me in her little 3-year-old voice and said, oh, well, she said, and it was because she'd heard me say it so many times. She said, so I felt really happy that I was, modeling something for the next generation of women and raising a strong, confident young daughter who wasn't going to, second guess, apologize, shrink, feel terrible because she made a perfectly normal mistake and wasn't expecting herself to be perfect.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Sally, it's been wonderful talking to you. Just as we wrap up, just a small thought experiment for you.
All right.
If you could send a Twitter-sized message to all the women out there to unlock their leadership potential, what would you say?
To all the women, I would say to articulate what you intend to achieve. That is real from you, that is something that would motivate you and drive you forward, and to work on that statement and to keep that with you at all times so that you will be ready to speak your purpose in the world.
And if you could send a Twitter message to all the men, what would that say to unlock women's leadership potential?
To unlock women's leadership potential, I think that listening, I would say listen to what they say, but then also question. I find a lot of men will say things like, I offered her this job and she said she wasn't ready. She said she was, still had things to learn and the job she has. And I don't know why she does that. And she must be getting ready to have another baby or she's not ambitious. Just listening to what she says and then saying, I think you're ready for this. I just want you to consider this. You don't need to give me an answer right now, but if you want to do it, I'm in your corner. So I think letting people know that you're there as an ally, that you notice what kind of talent they have, and that you want to support them. Men can get an unreasonable amount of points with women when they do that.
And finally, what would you tell the CEOs and CHROs in creating a climate where women can flourish?
Oh, well, I think the most important thing that leaders need to do to create that kind of environment is to be very, very clear about what their expectations are in terms of what constitutes an effective job that you do. Be very clear on that. There's often a sort of lack of clarity about it, and I think that's confusing to many people. It's particularly often confusing to women.
Sally, is there anything I may not have asked you explicitly in the context of unlocking women leadership that's relevant for the listeners?
No, I think we've had a very wide-ranging and thoughtful conversation. I've enjoyed it tremendously. And, I want to iterate that the one thing I'm left with from these many decades I've been in this field is a great, great sense of optimism. I see women becoming far more self-confident. I think there's a much greater sense of solidarity among women. I know that has developed over the last 30 years. And much greater understanding that they need men as allies and that they have a right to expect that. So I think all of those things have put us on a great track. I think we've made wonderful moves forward, but I think the future is wide open and I'm very hopeful.
Sally, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for making the time and for your insights.
Thank you, Deepak. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening. If you found the podcast purposeful, do take a moment and contribute to Antarang Foundation. I work closely with them and can vouch for their impact with young adults who come from challenging backgrounds. Given the COVID context, while we are battling the health crisis, we cannot afford to ignore the issue of solving for livelihoods in our battle to save lives. This second COVID wave has further worsened the employment crisis in India, and supporting an organization like Antarang can mean a lot in these challenging times. You can get more details at the paid forward section at playtopotential.com. If you want to know more, just email me. Do rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts or wherever you consume the content. It might seem like a monotonous or a repetitive ask, but trust me, it makes a big difference in people discovering the podcast amidst a lot of noise out there, given the boom in the podcast supply in the last few months in India. It also helps us attract good quality speakers because they look at these metrics. To know more about what's in the podcast archives and the advisory work I do, you could just visit playtopotential.com. If you liked the conversation with Sally, you might specifically like the curated playlist on women leadership. All you have to do is go to playtopotential.com, go to the curated playlist section, and within that, find the section on women's leadership, where multiple women leaders have shared their perspectives on what it takes to unlock women's leadership potential. Thank you, and hope to have you tune into one of the subsequent conversations of the podcast. Bye now.